Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome indeed to our professional learning event looking at the important issue of diversity within the teaching profession in Scotland. My name is Kevin Brack, and I'm the Senior Teaching Fellow in Educational Leadership at the University of Edinburgh's Murray House School of Education and Sport. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel this evening. First of all, Professor Rowena Arshole, CBE, who chaired the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group and is Professor Emerita in Multicultural and Anti-Racist Education at the University of Edinburgh's Murray House School of Education and Sport, where she was also head of school from 2013 to 2019. So thank you for joining us, Rowena. We also have Khadjia Mohammed, who is a senior lecturer at the University of the West of Scotland and a founding member of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators, SAME, and she also served on the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group. Melina Valdelivre is the lead specialist for race equality education Scotland and the co-founder of the Anti-Racist Educator. Welcome, Melina. And last but not least, we have Sharon Smith, who is QIO for Professional Learning Leadership at Fife Council and previously served as Senior Education Officer at the GTCS, where she was also involved in the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group. So a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here, especially you, Professor Arshole, who could be enjoying your emerita status in any way that you wished. You've chosen to be with us tonight, so thank you very much indeed for that. So before we begin our discussion, just to set the context, I'm sure lots of folk who are here tonight will know the context really well, but just to set it out for everybody briefly, Teaching in a Diverse Scotland was a landmark report which was released in 2018, which looked at the issue of diversity within the teaching profession. The working group was led by Professor Arshole, who authored the original report, and this group published a follow-up report in March 2021, which outlined areas of progress and identified priorities for future work. The report set a target for 2030 that the teaching workforce reflected the wider population in terms of diversity. A year on from the release of the follow-up report, this panel discussion tonight aims to examine the progress made and discusses where more work is required. So we're going to kick off by looking at a really important issue, which is the mutating nature of racism in 2022. So one of the lines that really struck me most when looking again at the working group's follow-up report was that racism has mutated, and that whilst we still absolutely have overt and deliberate racism in our system and in our country, we also have the dimension of microaggressions and unconscious bias. So if I could start with you first, Rowena, and then come to each of our panel members in turn, and just get you to talk a little bit about how racism has mutated, what your thoughts are around that, and what that might look like in the system in 2022. So Rowena, if I can come to you first, and I'll come to the other colleagues after that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin. I think that as you say, it's not the overt. I think all of us know how to deal with the overt. For me, it's the subtle changes in curriculum. That is a really powerful tool, and I think it's one that we haven't used as much as to our benefit as we could do. How it's mutated, I think, is become more subtle as far as I'm concerned. I do think that the age-old Scottish chestnut of we're all Jock Tamson's bairns and we're, all that, I think that's still lurking somewhere. The ease that we might say, it happens in England, but not in Scotland, that's kind of still around, and we shouldn't take our foot off the gas. I also think that there might be tensions, I guess. For a long time, people of colour, Black minority ethnic people's voices were just not heard. And now that they are beginning to be heard, there are also other groups which are minoritized, whether they're Gypsy travellers or whether there is white minorities like Eastern Europeans. And we've got to watch that we're not in these competing spaces in a way that is detrimental to each other, that we move forward together, because it's ultimately where we are united. For example, with Gypsy travellers and minority ethnic people of colour is systemic oppression. So we cannot forget those kinds of base as things mutate. That's my starter for 10.
then moving on to working with Education Scotland, and I worked with the anti-racist educator before that. I found it helpful thinking about racism in different types of racism. So interpersonal racism, that could be the sort of overt, explicit racism, name calling, graffiti, that sort of thing. But also the smaller, subtle forms of racism, such as racial microaggressions. So in a classroom, that could be a subtle comment about a pupil not being able to do well enough in a certain area because of the color of their skin, or guidance teacher telling them that they shouldn't really be aiming for that career because that's not what their people do. So those sort of comments are really racial microaggressions, but that can lead to internalized racism. So the young person might start believing that about themselves. They're not able to reach their or have the same aspirations as other majority ethnic pupils, for example, if they keep hearing those messages and internalizing them. And that is also how majority white Scottish pupils will be internalizing the racial prejudice, all the negative messages they get through the curriculum or those interpersonal interactions. And one of those impacts it can have is also the well-being. It will affect educators of colour, young people of colour, children of colour, and there's a term we use a lot, racial trauma, to refer to that. So when we're thinking about racism, we should also be thinking about the health and well-being of those who experience racism. And then beyond that, we've got the wider structural institutional nature of racism. How are institutions responding to serving the needs of those young people who experience racism and those teachers who are experiencing racism? When they raise a grievance, for example, as an educator, are they well supported? What is we doing as an institution to support the needs of educators, children, young people who experience racism?
And I certainly know from my own learning and talking with other people as well that the professional learning that our colleagues, our teachers in schools require to be able to actually speak out against any microaggressions, whether that's what they're seeing in the classroom or whether it's what they're seeing in the staff room, and confidently be able to articulate why they aren't right is an issue currently just now. I think we're very much more aware of George Floyd, Black Lives Matters, all of the things that have rightly come to our attention, but we need to be able to then now talk about that and then confidently knowing what we're seeing is supporting that anti-racist approach.
I think we've got to, in Scotland, find a way of, now that the anti-racist agenda has come onto the agenda after, 20, 30 years, how do we keep it on the agenda without people kickbacking and saying, oh, that's pandering to the woke culture or whatever? So I think that's an issue for us in Scotland that we've got to think about, because I think there's a danger that might happen. So I kind of not quite answered your question, but I throw that out there, because the folk who are on this online with us tonight are all people who are interested in the issue. They want to move forward. In a way, we are the converted that are already here. So we need to watch for those, because I think those kickback reactions, I can see it already starting in different corners, not as obviously as in England. Everybody will have noticed this guidance that came out to teachers in England over the last 2 days about how to teach in a way that is not biased and impartial. And what the heck do they think the profession has been doing all this time? Teachers have grappled with these issues, but
work that Rowena's touched on there, the wider stakeholder group, there's 4 subgroups within that, Kevin, and one's looking at racist bullying. I think I can't remember the exact title of the subgroup, and even within that there was conversations around. We tended to assume that a lot of that was taking place from one child to another child. But what we were getting to kind of highlight that actually some of that racism that we experience within schools is a BAME teacher experiences it from a fellow teacher, and it's not just young people, and that we need to address that. Because I don't know, I used to have this naive view that no teacher could cause harm in this area, but clearly, as research tells us and our young people tell us, that it's a case there. But there's a number of issues, within that, Kevin. So. But I'll leave it to there. And I think there's also this misunderstanding around it. Recently, I was in another webinar with our union, and somebody said, we're really addressing this really well, Khadjia. We've created a multicultural club. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, please. And I said, we didn't know what to call it, but we decided to call it a multicultural club. And I said, please, if I can give you one piece of advice, don't call it a multicultural club. There's something problematic about that term. And I think I grew up in the 80s, and you think, I grew up with the whole steel bands, saris, samosas rhetoric. And I think it's a lot to do, I blame it for a lot of this. Oh, it's Chinese New Year, or it's Ramadan, let's get something to talk about, fasting and so on. And I said, please call it perhaps something to do with maybe, your school's anti-racist club. And this particular teacher said, oh, no, I couldn't do that, Khadjia. I just don't like the term anti-racism. And that was just so telling that there was a real misunderstanding of actually what that term means, that you're actually identifying, recognizing and beginning to address it. And the anti-racism work is rooted in action, but there was a real misunderstanding there, Kevin. And I'm sure it's not just in that particular school. Sorry, I go off on a tangent, so I'll stop there.
I think that's a really important point. And I wonder as well if you think about communities, as you say, Khadjia, that have very, very small numbers of minority ethnic people in their neighbourhoods, in their communities, or in their school communities. Do you think it is a lack of understanding, or do you think the lack of understanding is so narrow that they've not built that kind of depth of understanding that you described there?
Yeah, Kevin, there will be lots of areas, it's lots of schools where there will be perhaps either it's a large diverse group or a much smaller ethnic group within school settings. And I think the argument really is, we often talk about our children ready for school. And I always kind of turn that and say, well, are the schools ready for the young people to come in? And that's irrespective. Why do we need to wait for the one diverse family to come in before we start asking questions of, is our curriculum fit for purpose? Do we actually have policies that speak to this family that is relevant for them? And then we scurry around looking for, particular things to add or looking for those role models. And so actually it's about having those questions at the centre of everything that we do. And there was a discussion, I had a very brief discussion with Rowena a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if Rowena will remember this term, all learners. We see that in all our policies and our documents. And I'm saying, Rowena, when we talk about all learners, there's an assumption that we make instinctively that it's all white learners. And we need to really unpack that, because that will really help us to make sure that our policies are then fit for purpose, that we're speaking to all learners in terms of whether they've got English as an additional language, whether they come from a diverse ethnic background. So for me, it really is about having that kind of holistic view and not just waiting for, the one odd diverse child that comes into our schools that we then have to step up to action. We need to have those policies in place in the first instance.
You a bit of background on what's going in Scotland. The Building Racial Literacy Programme is a professional learning programme prototype that has been co-constructed with a range of anti-racist organisations, including the Scottish Association for Minority Ethnic Educators, so with Khadjia here, and it's part of the wider Scottish Government programme of work looking at race, equality and anti-racism in education. And this first iteration of this prototype program is really designed to build the racial literacy of educators across Scotland. And what we mean by racial literacy, we're really looking at developing people's understanding of racism. And just to touch on the point about misconceptions about racism, there's still that misconception that racism is really about individual hate and prejudice, and it's usually intentional, and that wider systemic but also endemic nature racism is misunderstood. There's a misunderstanding that racism is not really an issue in Scotland, it's more an issue in England or in the US, but not really in Scotland. So in this program, we're really trying to raise people's awareness of how racism works in Scotland, uplifting, amplifying those experiences of racism in Scottish education, so that educators become aware of how it can operate, even within their classrooms, often unintentionally because they're unaware. So
I think it's really important to hear your voices too. So if you do want to contribute either through the chat or through raising your hands, please feel free to do that. Don't feel like you're interrupting our flow at all, because we're very happy to hear from you. So Rowena, I think that point really links really well to the next theme I wanted to look at, which was thinking about the difference between plans and positive actions, and the kind of tensions between plans and positive actions. Because I think the follow-up report from March of 2021 outlines a huge amount of work that's happened across the system at national level in terms of creating policies and plans and approaches around this important work. But there's less evidence of positive action being taken by local authorities, by national organisations, and also at school level too. Could you kick us off, Rowena, and just share your kind of perspective on that in terms of, are we getting the balance right between plans and positive action? If we aren't getting the balance right, what do we need to do in terms of kicking into action with more urgency?
I think that at leadership level in local authorities and in initial teacher education, I think we could explore the Equality Act a bit more, Equality Act 2010, to see what is allowed and what's not allowed. And I haven't done enough to ensure that... I'm
sorry to interrupt you. Your sound's gone a little bit awry there. Would you mind turning your camera off and see if that helps with the audio?
Is this better?
Slightly. Do you want to try again?
Yes. I don't know if it'll get any better.
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So when I was head of school, I wanted to diversify the students coming in to Murray House. And I wanted to put positive action measures in place, which is allowable under law, to get more men into primary teaching, more women into science, but also more Black multi-ethnic people generally. And I think that all of us, whether at local authority or ITE, can do more about looking at what legislation enables us to do to actually close the underrepresentation gap. And I don't think we've done enough. And I think we each need to be identifying for our specific areas what is possible. So that would start. The problem, I think, is that lawyers within local authorities and the legal teams within universities are very cautious. So you need to actually work with lawyers who have understanding of equality legislation.
And, Rowena's really highlighted the key issues there. I'm thinking of positive action in many ways, and you touched on the roles at Glasgow City Council. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll go on to ITE, because that's something that I'm particularly interested in and critical of. The Glasgow City Council posts, and that's something I'm sure Melina can come in as well at any point, because it's something that we've both raised time and time again, that when those posts were ring-fenced, Kevin, I think there needed to be some groundwork done as well, and prepare for potential pushback, because many of our BAME teachers who were quite positive about the roles, some were actually quite reluctant to put themselves forward. And they were reluctant because of the possible implications that they might face if they're talking to their fellow white colleagues, and some of them did, as in, that's interesting, why isn't that post available to me to apply? So that lack of understanding around positive action, but also, so they were facing some of that pushback within the staff room, and they were trying to kind of distance themselves from it. Some were saying, gosh, no, I don't want a step up, Khadjia, because that's how they saw it. It was like a step up. Someone's giving me a hand up, and so it's this whole meritocracy debate. I want to get there on my own merit. And so when we talk about also just the whole racial literacy and understanding the issues around the challenges of BAME teachers, Kevin, it goes beyond just talking to our white teachers, and Melina has very skillfully included that within the Building Racial Literacy programme, because within that we need to also build the racial literacy of our BAME colleagues.
Wonderful reflections for us. Melina, did you want to come in on that point?
Sure, thanks, Khadjia. There's been so much to think about in terms of positive action, supporting those educators who are thinking about applying for posts where there is positive action, also after they've gained those promoted positions, the pushback they might face, any stigma around that. So lots of really important things to think about, and also provocation, thinking about which educators of colour are benefiting the most from positive action, because obviously BAME is not one homogenous group. There's a lot of anti-blackness, lots of other different types of racism within that bigger frame. So positive action is a really important step forward, but we have to be very critical about how we're using it. So I can give you the example of building racial literacy as a professional learning program that we've been developing. We wanted to make sure that we recruited enough Black, Asian and minority ethnic educators to make sure that the program itself does not replicate any structural barriers for Black, Asian and minority ethnic educators. In other words, if only white educators received this professional learning, went on this professional learning program, got it on their CVs, and then applied for all these different diversity jobs, then we would actually be creating a structural barrier for those educators of colour who wouldn't have benefited from this program.
You've put me on the spot now, Kevin. I was thinking, what did I put in the chat? I think it was regarding what Nuzad was talking about around teachers and the opportunities that they get in terms of even the positive action. The things that Nuzad you've raised are really important, and I think we can't stress them enough, that what we've got to really remember is any such action that we take, there will be misunderstandings on both counts. So BAME teachers misunderstand that because they think, well, gosh, no, I don't want a leg up. Yeah, I want to get there on my own merit. So this whole debate on meritocracy starts to come to the fore. But then there's also that aspect of the pushback that they're going to receive from their fellow colleagues, like Nuzad spoke about in the staff room, like, how come you get to apply for that and I don't? And I think that when Glasgow did release those posts, I think there should have been some groundwork done beforehand to prepare both our BAME teachers, but also the majority ethnic white teachers about why this is happening. So yeah, there's complexity there, Kevin, because quite often, and it's back to that point, and I'm reminded of, and I put it in the chat, Ruxana, she's here today. Ruxana wrote a fantastic blog and shared it, and in that was just so typical of what many BAME teachers experience. So back to your own schooling that you started off this conversation with, but also then your ITE education there, not having the chance to explore your identity, your racial identity development. And then when you go into school, what the majority of BAME teachers do is try to fit in. So what we're effectively doing is playing white, right? For fear of the implications of being different or being perceived to be different. And so therefore, we don't recognise that our culture, our language, perhaps our religion, actually would have a powerful part to play in the culture responsive pedagogies that my colleagues have been talking about here. And so we tend to kind of leave them as well and don't think it's important. So there are real issues there about the support of creating safer, braver spaces, I guess, for leaders to recognise the added wealth, that community cultural wealth that BAME teachers bring with them, but also helping BAME teachers to recognise that in themselves. Because from Ruxana's blog, I could certainly feel, Ruxana, the frustration. Why didn't somebody tell me this before? Why didn't I think that I could code switch and use my Urdu or my Punjabi in the classroom? Why didn't I feel comfortable doing that right from the get-go? So we've got a lot of complex issues there, Kevin.